Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be covering Spider-Man 2099, and if you don't know already, last week when the patch dropped, my phone pretty much died, so I wasn't able to test anything during the week, and most of my testing has just been over the weekend. Because of this, I'm not really going to be releasing the full number of videos to cover all of the characters for this update, and most of my testing is going to be a lot more restricted and not as in-depth as my previous videos. My schedule is also starting to get busier, so I won't really have as much time to make videos, especially in-depth ones, as I had before, and I'm not really sure how I'm going to handle content creation moving forward. I'm going to try and experiment and perhaps do 1 or 2 live streams on the weekends after patches drop, so that I can kind of quickly cover some of the characters' upgrades, new uniforms, new characters, new modes perhaps, and maybe get those to the players earlier so they can watch those videos. The only downside is that it's not going to be as in-depth and probably not as clean-cut as some of the videos that I edit and kind of condense the length down. I'll maybe try and put some bookmarks or kind of timestamps so people can go to certain things quicker, then they don't have to necessarily watch a 2-hour video or something like that of the live stream. But for now, I think that's what I'm going to try to do. Otherwise, I won't really be able to keep up and keep making videos in the future. I'll probably do that for the PvE side since it's easier to test that out, and I could probably do that in a stream or two just to cover all of the patch. But for the PvP testing, I'll likely make follow-up videos for those. And if there is a particular character or uniform, like a major one, such as for Wolverine, I might consider making a full in-depth video for that, since that will probably be more interesting to me and most people might want to know more about big characters or native tier 2s or things like that. The PvE testing for Spider-Man 2099 is mostly just going to be in World Boss Legend. Since the character doesn't have a T4, he will probably be outclassed in things like Alliance Battle Extreme and Alliance Battle Legend, so I didn't really bother testing him there. Because I had a mighty CTP of Destruction on the character previously, that's what I'm testing on him throughout the video, both in PvE and PvP. And if you decide to build him for PvE, I would probably still recommend going with Destruction, especially a mighty one with that top proc, since the character won't really be used at very high stages, and you'll probably just use a level 80 or T4 character anyway. And the Destruction gives you some value in World Boss Legend and some PvE modes, while also making the character viable for PvP modes, as you'll see a little bit later. The other obvious reason for the CTP of Destruction recommendation is because the character is really proc friendly. You could potentially use a CTP of Energy if you wanted to focus the character on PvE content, but then you won't really be able to use him in PvP, and overall I think you get more value with the CTP of Destruction, especially if you can reforge it into that mighty one. The character got a pretty significant upgrade with the latest uniform, considering that the old one really only changed his 5th skill. With this new one, he gets a ton of different damage buffs and still retains that damage accumulation from the 5th skill, as well as being able to move around and avoid taking damage. The only real downside that I saw in his kit is that he is missing Ignore Dodge outside of his leadership. For the most part, you're not really going to be using his leadership since there are better options to get way more damage out of it. So that is why something like a Mighty Destruction that gives you that Ignore Dodge burst from the top proc, or a CTP of Energy that gives you Ignore Dodge is useful for the character, especially if you're trying to take him into higher stages of World Boss Legend, where Ignore Dodge plays a bigger factor. Didn't have any problems with the character around the mid-level stages for Null and Mephisto. His restrictions lie somewhere around 45 to 55 for those bosses. However, once I went up against Gore, it was a little bit tougher because he moves around so often, and because I found that the skill animations for 2099 usually end up lasting a fair bit of time, which is enough time for Gore to go in his penetration or iframe ignore skills, the ones that have the purple aura, and you end up taking damage from that. On top of that, the Ignore Dodge starts to become noticeable, and furthermore, Gore usually goes into phases that have those shadow monsters summoned, and because 2099 doesn't really have much AoE outside of the 5th skill, when that skill is down, if there's a lot of those up, you don't really have enough damage with that single skill damage proc to be able to complete those phases fast enough. You usually have to swap out and let a character die to be able to complete that. Because of that reason and some of the other ones that I mentioned, I wasn't really able to complete stage 29, and I actually ended up dying, but if I did play it through, I probably would have finished with around 7 health bars left, so he still wouldn't have been able to complete it anyway. The rotation for the character is pretty straightforward, and if you want to build up your ultimate faster, I recommend using the 1 and 2 cancel in the beginning, but for the most part, the basic rotation for the character is to do 3, cancel 4, slight delay cancel, so the animation kind of starts up and the damage registers, and then go into your 5th skill. In the next rotation, you will have your ultimate available, and you basically just want to do a 1 cancel, 2 cancel, 5 cancel, 3 cancel, and then 4 slight delay cancel into the 6th skill, which is the one that you want to proc on because it also has that 200 damage proc increase for that skill on top of the proc that you have for your CTP. Overall, I'd say the character is actually quite good in PvE. Even with a single skill damage proc, he can easily do things like Giant Boss Raid and World Boss Legend for his restrictions, and he also gains the benefit of White Fox's support, which allows him to perform even a little bit better than some other characters because he can leverage that awesome support that she has. The only real thing holding him back, like I mentioned previously, is the fact that he doesn't really have Ignore Dodge, and the fact that he can't really compete with level 80s and T4s in higher World Boss Legend stages and in content that really matters, like ABX and ABL. Most people aren't really going to be using the character in PvE, they're likely going to use him in PvP, specifically Alliance Conquest. You can't really make use of him in things like Timeline because they didn't give him premier PvP characteristics or abilities like iframe ignore, which are pretty much essential and almost absolutely needed for things like Timeline and the new PvP mode that came out. Despite the devs not giving him iframe ignore, he does have a bunch of things in his kit to make him PvP viable for things like Alliance Conquest. And you can see in Timeline that he absolutely destroys the characters that aren't meta. For those that are meta, he is able to at least take out 1 life and potentially even 2 lives. The main reason for that is because his passive is constantly activated and puts him in an iframe, and when he's not in an iframe from that, he usually goes in an iframe in his other skills. On top of that, the character also has high guaranteed dodge, meaning that even if the opponent uses an iframe ignore skill, there is a chance that he'll miss some of the hits from that skill and be able to survive to deal his own damage. Furthermore, his skills also have pretty high skill priority, meaning that he'll go into them before the opponents, but for the most part he usually opens with the 5th skill, and if the opponent has an iframe ignore and they are a meta character, he usually gets blitzed pretty fast and will end up dying. But if he doesn't, that CTP of destruction will allow him to at least take out 1 life of the opponent, and if the opponent doesn't have any iframe ignore, then they're going to have a really hard time taking him down, since he's, like I mentioned, going to be in iframes pretty much almost all the time and going to be dealing a huge amount of damage with that CTP of destruction and going through the opponent's invincible. If you wanted to go with a defensive build, you could also try a CTP of Authority. I don't really think you'll get much use out of something like a regen or a CTP of Refinement, since his base health and recovery is pretty low. But if you do go with a CTP of Authority, there is a chance that you will not have enough damage and will possibly struggle versus meta characters that also have Invincible, since he does lack penetration. I wasn't really able to test much in Alliance Conquest, but I did want to see if he could solo characters that had iframe ignore, such as Mephisto and Dormammu, and he was able to survive with that guaranteed dodge, even without having a survival based build, and with that penetration and the proc was able to take out both lies of those characters as well as Apocalypse. The second fight obviously doesn't really pose a challenge at all, but I posted it to show the character's skill priority and how quickly he goes into the 5th skill in iframe before the characters on the opponent side can even really react or do anything to him. Even though the uniform is visually amazing and the character is actually pretty fun to play, sadly I don't think many people will get much value from this character or this uniform unless you use him for Alliance Conquest. I have to say that I am getting pretty annoyed with the devs updating characters that have a base kit that is favorable for PvP and giving those characters no additional modern PvP characteristics or upgrades, such as iframe ignore, potentially penetration in their kit, or other things like super guard break, and instead give them PvE centered upgrades like boss damage or reduced boss damage. The reason I'm annoyed by this is because 2099 had a perfect base kit that they could have worked up from to make a really great PvP character. On top of that, Miles was focused towards PvE, especially with his T4, so what chance does 2099 have to be able to compete with him? Why not actually push him in the direction that they initially had designed him, where people could use him as a counter in the new PvP mode once they fix the restrictions, and the character could actually be a standout in certain modes like Alliance Conquest. Right now, he's pretty much just going to be overshadowed in all PvE modes and will be just a little bit above the mid-level range in Alliance Conquest, as opposed to being one of the great speed characters in that mode. At first, I was disappointed, but now I'm just really getting annoyed that more and more characters that had a great base PvP kit and potential to be awesome PvP characters are pretty much just left to have no usage whatsoever. Groot was one of them, where he could have gotten Awakening and been amazing in PvP with that revive, and Ant-Man was another one that also had that really high guaranteed dodge, where he could have been great if he had an iframe ignore, but instead they pushed him towards PvE, and no one is using him for that. So again, I'm just annoyed and frankly confused at the decisions they're making because it doesn't make sense. They gave Miles an artifact that mirrors Spider-Man's that is meant for PvP, but the character excels in PvE, whereas for 2099, they gave him an artifact that makes him do better versus characters that are creature and I believe aliens, which is kind of more focused for PvE and things like ABX and ABL, but the character doesn't really shine in PvE and is meant more so for PvP. So I just can't make sense of these decisions. Why give a character that is focused for PvE a PvP artifact, and a character that could have been great for PvP a PvE artifact when he's not even able to reach level 80 and even have a chance of competing with a T4 speed type that is focused for PvE? At this point I'm ranting, but I mean, their decisions just don't make any sense. You can give a character an iframe ignore and push them towards PvP without necessarily making them awful for PvE. They did this with characters like Electro, for example, that's great in both modes, and they can easily do it with more characters, especially premium ones like 2099 is. The next one that I'll be looking at is Spot, which they actually did a great job on, and I'll cover that in the video. You can also get access to the character now with tokens through the event, which they also did in a really good way, where you don't have to waste tokens and miss out on the other rewards, and you can just pick him up along with the quest as it goes on. That pretty much wraps up this one. If you enjoyed the video and found it helpful, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And as always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these, so thank you. But the video is now over.